So what we're going to do, this is very much an introductory type course, but at the same time, as Melissa mentioned, this is kind of a good refresher. We all research in very different ways. All of our brains think differently. So let's just jump on in. So what is family history? People start this journey for many different reasons. I know somebody in the chat mentioned that they kind of got started using their mom's genealogy files, which is really, really cool to be able to kind of inherit something like that. Some people start doing genealogy research to find their biological families, people who might be adopted, maybe had an absent parent. Sometimes it's to understand things like generational silence. You know, your parents didn't want to talk about their childhood. They didn't want to talk about their family. Maybe you want to figure out why. But sometimes it's just a really dramatic family story that kind of brings you into this, that makes you want to start doing this research. But no matter what the reason is, the desire to learn and understand more about your story and your family story is really at the root of family history research. So what we are going to do today is kind of go over some key components of starting your family history journey. Namely, we're going to talk about gathering information, learning about what sources you need to learn more, and also where to find those sources or find those records. A few tips for when you do those early searches in databases like Ancestry or Family Search. And we'll finish up by talking about analyzing documents to figure out what is real and what isn't real. So we all have to start somewhere. So we're start with gathering that information. The first thing you want to do is just start with what you know. You'll be surprised by how much information you do know, but if you don't know something, that's okay. So what I like to do when I start a new genealogy project on a new family or maybe a new branch of my family, I like to kind of get my thoughts organized. To do that, I like to use a couple different like worksheet type things. First being a 5-generation pedigree chart, also an ancestry chart. So I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I'm a very visual person. When I start by filling out a chart like this, I can actually see physical holes in the chart that'll show holes in my own knowledge. And that lets me know where I might want to start looking for more information. Also, these charts are very handy after you actually start doing those searches in online databases, because you'll have all of this information kind of in one handy location. So I want to give y'all a visual of what I mean by gaps in knowledge. So this is a tiny, tiny little portion of an ancestry chart that I did after I started trying to research my mom's side of the family. So Winifred Gonzalez was my grandmother, and I knew some stuff about her parents, but I didn't know anything about Claudia Crump. I knew the name of my great-grandfather's mother, but I didn't know really anything else. And it come to find out that some of the information I had in here was actually not right, was actually not correct, but it's good to get this stuff on paper. So you can see, okay, what do I need to look for? Another thing you guys can use is something called a family group sheet. So these come in handy, especially if you're trying to research people who were in large families that had multiple children, because it kind of summarizes basic information about each of the family members onto one page. Now, I want to make something abundantly clear. It is okay if you cannot fill out these charts when you start. In fact, most people cannot fill them out, or at least not to its entirety. Just the act of kind of just putting that pen to paper is really a helpful tool to kind of get your brain going, organize your thoughts, and to get an idea of what information you might want to start looking for. Now, after you've kind of organized your thoughts, the next thing you're going to want to do is ask questions. Now, I know Melissa actually mentioned during the introduction, it's really good when you can find things that family members might have, things like family Bibles. So it's important to ask questions of your family. So I just put together this short little list of oral history interview tips. We could do an entire other program on oral history, but I just want to give you some of the basics, right? So if you have family alive and willing to talk to you, doing an interview with them to learn more information can be a really important step after you've collected your own memories and knowledge. These interviews can be really important if you're asking questions about family members that you didn't know, and the person you were interviewing can provide information beyond things like names and dates that just add color to your family story. It gives you an idea of maybe, why did this person put this child up for adoption? Why did this person move? Did this person maybe have a drinking problem? Stuff like that. So, like I said, these stories can add more color to the overall story. So if your relative is willing and able to answer a few questions, you want to try to give them maybe a little bit of warning before you start the interview. I know that if someone started berating me with dozens of questions about my life out of nowhere, I would be a little bit put off. So keep that in mind when you're wanting to do this. It also doesn't help to plan your questions ahead of time, but that doesn't mean that you need to stick to a very specific script. If the person you're talking to starts to share a really interesting story that maybe you didn't think to even ask about, let them talk. Just go a little off book. It's okay. Another thing I want to mention is that for recording, try to record these conversations if you can. If you don't have a fancy recorder, that's okay. There are dozens of recording apps out there that you can get on your phone. In fact, when I interviewed my grandmother, who is this lady right here, she, at the time when I did a family history interview with her, I was living in New York City and she was living in Oxford, Mississippi. So I actually recorded our phone call with a call recording app that I downloaded onto my phone. Another thing I want to mention is that family photos can be a great conversation starter, especially if you are talking to someone who might have trouble recalling certain events. But there's one really important thing I want you to get from this. Respect and empathy can go a very long way. That sounds like a no-brainer, but it can be very easy to get wrapped up in the excitement of a project and forget that you might be asking your parents or grandparents or other relatives to recall memories that are potentially painful, potentially traumatic. Genealogy research can be an incredibly emotional journey. So just understanding the emotional boundaries of the person you're talking to, I think, is really, really important. So after you've gathered information, both your information, maybe filled in some gaps with some family members, the next thing you're going to want to do is ask yourself, what do I want to learn more about? So once you figure out what you want to learn more about, the next step is to figure out what sources you need and, most importantly, where you can find them, which is the whole purpose of this slide. So what I did was I made two groups of types of records. I know this slide can look a little bit overwhelming. These are the basic things you're going to want to try to figure out about an ancestor. You're going to want to know on the front end, just where they're born, when they're born, and if and who they married, where they lived, and when did they die, and where did they die. So this group one, these are the things you're going to want to look for first. We're going to go through all of these bullet points. I'll show you some examples from each. But think of this stuff like movie genres. That's a good way to think of what I mean by these, and I'll explain in a couple moments. So as I said, the ones in group one, these are the ones you're going to want to start with. But as you learn more, you'll probably want to start digging into the records I put into group two. These are going to relate to things that you can maybe find in courthouses if they haven't been digitized yet, which a lot of things have been. Not everything, but a lot of things have been. So things like land and deed records, wills and probate records, that's the type of stuff you would probably traditionally find in a courthouse. And then we'll talk about some military records and also immigration. So there are loads of very different types of juicy records out there that are super fun and exciting to find. We're not going to get into all of those, obviously, because we would be here for days. But list will just kind of get you started on the path to find more. So let's start first with government records. So when I say government records, I'm referring to anything that would be produced by either the county, state, or federal government. Some big kind of examples of these types of records that will help you the most at the beginning of your journey are going to be things like birth and death certificates. Now, this will depend on the time period because birth and death certificates, the concept of that is kind of new, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. Also, civil registrations for birth, death, and marriage. Now, I put an asterisk by this because this isn't the type of thing you will find everywhere. You will see this in countries like Ireland and the UK, but I wanted to include some examples of records from some other countries, just so you can get an idea of what else is out there. So that's kind of what this is, but it would be considered a government record. And the other thing, the big thing you're going to want to look for is the census. So the US federal and state census are going to be really important for finding things like approximate dates of birth, where people are living, who they're living with, occupation, and all that jazz. So let's look at 3 examples of these types of government records, and we'll see what we can learn from them. So this first record is actually an Irish birth certificate for my great-grandfather, Samuel Nevin Hodges. This record, my aunt actually, who started to do the research for this side of the family about 20-ish years ago. She got this record many, many years ago from the Irish government. She wrote to them, requested it, and this is the document they sent her. So if we look at this record, we can see his date of birth, his name, Samuel Nevin. Also, the name, surname, and residence of both parents. So his father, Robert Hodges, says he's living in Swellian, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny little town kind of neighborhood in County Cavan. His mother, Joanna Hodges, formerly Carol, so that would have been her maiden name. Rank or profession of father. So we know that he's working for the railway. Another thing I like to point out is when registered. So this is something that you'll see, especially in the late 19th century. They registered his birth several months after he was born. And the reason why was because a lot of parents wanted to wait to make sure their child would actually live before registering their birth. Because I believe they would have had to pay to register their birth. So they are going to wait. So this is kind of an interesting thing I like to point out to people. Now, the next record we're going to look at is actually a death certificate. So this death certificate is for a lady named Louise Leposer. So this was my great aunt. She would have passed away April 8th, 1952. Now, the reason why I actually ordered her death certificate from the Secretary of State's office in Louisiana is because there was some question about what condition she actually passed away from. Like, what did she actually die from? My grandmother, when I talked to her about some of this stuff, she said that Louise had epilepsy and that she was institutionalized after her mother and grandmother died in the 1940s, because they were actually the people who were caring for her. When I found this record, I could see place of death, Jackson in East Feliciana Parish, and she died in the East Louisiana State Mental Hospital. That was actually still open. It is the oldest mental health hospital in Louisiana, and it's a state-run facility. She had been there for 9 years, 1 month, and 13 days. So another kind of interesting thing about this record, usual residence of the deceased, this address in New Orleans, that was the address of my great-grandfather. The reason why I kind of find this interesting is because according to my grandmother, Louise and her husband did not get along. They were estranged, and her husband did not keep track of her after she was institutionalized. So it would make sense that this address, that it's the address of her brother. This record also confirms that she did have epilepsy. Now, I had kind of wondered if maybe she had another condition, just because her grandmother at one point on the census was shown living here, but it does confirm she did have epilepsy. Kind of an interesting thing at the bottom. Oh, I missed a thing. Well, it also, so death certificates, I meant to point this out, well, should usually list the names of the father and name and maiden name of mother. But the reason why this one isn't is because the person who's filling out this information is, the informant is the hospital. The hospital doesn't care. They just want to get the form filled out. So when you look at death records like this, the information listed here, you do have to analyze it in the sense that the information is only as good as the informant. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you do look at death certificates. Now at the bottom, we can see some information about her burial. And this can be used to then later on find cemetery records, which we'll talk a little bit about in a couple minutes. So next we're going to talk about the census. So one of the most useful sources of information you guys are going to need to look for when you start your research is the federal census. So the US Census has been taken every 10 years since 1790. And all have, for the most part, survived except for the 1890 census, which was lost in a fire. So now until next spring, when the 1950 census is released, the most recent census we can access until next spring is 1940. So because of this, starting your research with whatever family member of yours that would have been born before 1940, whether that be a parent, grandparent, etc., this is kind of your happy place to start. So census records from the information you'll get from the census, it's going to vary year to year because the questions were not always the same. The things that the government was interested in learning about is going to change decade to decade. And now in the census from 1880 to present, those have kind of the most amount of detail, and they can offer some really, really rich information, like names, relationships, approximate birth years, marital status, birthplaces of both the individual and the birthplaces of parents. So I'm going to show you a family from the 1940 census so you can get an idea of what information you can kind of squeeze out of it. Now, we could be here all day doing another program on just the census alone, where we would talk about what you learned decade to decade. So we're just going to focus on that basic information. Okay, so the family I wanted to show you actually lived in two residences next door to each other. At the top, you have my great-grandfather, Roy Gonzalez, and he's listed as the head of the household with his wife, Claudia, and my grandmother, Winifred, and her sister, Dorothy, who went by Dot. Now, next door, now we know this is another residence because we have another like house number over here. Next door, we have Lucille Legault, Yolanda, Frank, Louise Leposer. So you have head, daughter, son, another daughter, and then Louise Wood. That is the mother of Lucille Legault. Now, the reason why I wanted to just point out these two families together is because Lucille Legault was my great-grandfather's mother. They live next door to each other. And here's the thing, when you search an ancestry for either one of them, since they're not living in the same household, you're only going to see the people listed in this household. So it's important to look at the whole page. And I know this is kind of zoomed in a lot, so you can't actually see the address, but the address is listed actually along the side. I asked my grandmother if she remembers living in this house, and she said she did, and it was actually a duplex. And she mentioned to me that in this time frame, my great grandfather was financially supporting not only his own family, but his mother and his siblings and grandmother. So that's kind of important, like contextual information that kind of makes this even more interesting to look at. So we have the names, relationships, ages are going to be listed over here. Age with the census is going to be squishy. The census takers are not going to get everybody's ages right. If you're not home, they might talk to a neighbor. The neighbors don't know how old you are. So if it's within like kind of 5-ish years of whatever, of however old you think your ancestor might have been in this time frame, there's a margin of error, basically. We also have place of birth, and this census is also going to ask where you were living in April 1st, 1935. So that's a specific thing to the 1940 census, but this is kind of an example of how each census is maybe asked different questions sometimes. So that's this half of the page. When you look at the other half, you'll see more information about asking about school, language, and it also asks occupation. Now, we see that my great-grandfather is listed as a tailor and he owns his own store. Notice nobody below him in either his household or next door are working. So that tracks with that story that my grandmother told me. When you're told these family stories, they're not always true. And that's not saying that your family members are lying to you, but you do have an issue where people might forget things, might remember things differently. So take that information with a grain of salt. So the next kind of thing we're going to talk about are records you'll find from religious institutions. So the concept of birth and death records is a lot newer than most people realize. So at a certain point in your research, you aren't going to find government issued birth and death certificates. When that will happen for you will vary depending on the state, but to fill in that gap in government records, looking for records from religious institutions can be your next best bet in determining when someone was born, when they died, and when/who they married. Even if you're able to find that information from government records, you can still find, if you can still find your ancestor in some type of religious institutional record, you might uncover some really rich information they might not get from a government record. So we're going to unpack an example of a marriage record and a baptismal record to see what we can find. So this marriage record is for my great-great aunt from 1882. Her name was Amelia Hodges. She married this gentleman named Robert Cathcart. They were married in Dublin. So it's a Church of Ireland marriage, so they're not Catholic. We get a lot of information from this. So we have the age, which means age just means full, basically. Full is of age, they're not underage. Condition is basically marital status. So he's a bachelor, she is a spinster. Rank or profession, he's a civil engineer. Also the residence at the time of their marriage. And the name and father's name and surname, and also rank and profession of the father. This information right here, this is my great-great-grandfather. Yeah, that sounds right. What could verify for me that this was the right Amelia Hodges was the fact that I knew that Samuel Hodges worked for the Coast Guard. Since we have many Samuel Hodges in my family, my aunt and I actually refer to him as Samuel Hodges Coast Guard to differentiate. One thing that I kind of find interesting about this type of record is that you'll have witnesses listed, and this one at the top, this is actually my great-great-grandfather, Robert Hodges. So there's a lot of layers of information that you can get from records like this. So this is just kind of one example of a marriage record. Not all marriage records are going to look like this. That's one thing I want to point out. The records I show you, not all of them will look like this. Not all of them will have juicy information. Some of them won't give you very much, but it doesn't, you lose nothing by looking for them. So the next thing we're going to look at is a baptismal record. So depending on the religion or denomination, you can learn a lot of information from a baptismal record. This little list is just meant to show you what you can learn, but again, that doesn't mean that every record will look like the one we're about to look at. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't look for this record. So this baptismal record on the right is actually from my husband's grandmother. It's from 1916 from Spain. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see more clearly what it looks like, and I'll explain some of the context of this record. So if we zoom in at the very top, I know this is in Spanish, but I want to show you guys, you can research outside the United States. This is her name. So her name is Felisa Suarez Casal. She was baptized, it basically says baptized in this parish, July 16th, 1916. So she was from Galicia, which is in the northwestern part of Spain. This bottom part lists the names of her parents, Antonio and Maria Manuela. It says where they're from, which is also really helpful. And I mean, these places are not large cities. These are towns. So this is information that might not be the easiest to find. So this is the top half of the page. Now, if we go to the bottom half, it tells you the names of the paternal grandparents, where they're from, and maternal grandparents as well, again, where they're from, and the names of her godparents. The reason why I have this record, I know some Spanish genealogy records are online, but the reason why I actually have this is because when my husband's grandmother was getting married in New York, she didn't have this record and she needed it to get married in the Catholic Church. So this column over here, which is not in Spanish, it's actually in a dialect called Gallego. She had to write to the church and say, hey, I need this record. Can you send it to me? So my mother-in-law actually scanned this and sent it to me. So not everything you'll be able to find online. You can find a lot online, but you might have to contact people. Don't be afraid to contact people. So the next thing we're going to kind of talk about are cemeteries. Cemeteries can be really interesting because if you scratch just beyond the surface, you might find information beyond the names and the dates and locations that will only add to your larger family story. These two burial plots are kind of a good example of that. So this one for my great-grandfather, Roy Joseph Gonzalez, he is buried in the same cemetery as his wife, Claudia, and my great aunt, Dorothy. Now, there was apparently some type of crazy story as to why their plots, while they're in the same cemetery, they're not near each other, not remotely near each other. And my mom told me that apparently after my great-grandparents got married, Claudia, her mother, named Winifred Crump, purchased a 2-person burial plot in a cemetery in the New Orleans area for my great-grandparents, for the two of them, as like a gift. This was like a wedding gift, which is a little dark for a wedding gift. So my great-grandmother, she passes away in the 1950s, but then fast forward to 1966, Roy is still alive, but his daughter, Dorothy, she dies kind of unexpectedly in under rather pretty traumatic circumstances. So her father decided to bury her in his place next to my great-grandmother, and he purchased another plot for himself in another section of the cemetery. So yeah, that's why I kind of did that. Oh, I'm going back. Sorry. I guess my point is, if you find yourself in a situation like this in a cemetery, there's probably a reason for it. I was lucky that my mom was told this story by her great-grandmother, Winifred Crump, the woman who actually purchased these original plots. But you might not always be able to figure out what the exact reason is for why people are buried where. So just that's something to kind of keep in mind, that there's probably a reason for decisions like this. Now, there's a couple places you can look for cemetery type records. Find a grave is kind of the go-to. Find a grave, billing grave is another one. It's usually the first stop for people because it's linked with ancestry. This is a find a grave memorial for my grandmother. Sometimes the memorials will have, a picture of a headstone, or pictures of the individual, like in her case. There's often in the bio section, sometimes it's a bio that somebody has written, sometimes it's an obituary. This is something that can be edited by the masses, so I strongly encourage y'all to double check any info that's put in this section, just to make sure it's right. Another place to look for cemetery type records, aside from contacting the cemeteries themselves, is your local libraries, historical societies, and the genealogy center. Independent researchers, genealogy societies, and historical societies will sometimes gather records for cemeteries and publish them in things like periodicals or books. This is just one book in our collection that I wanted to point out, but we have dozens of other books like it. So I highly recommend reaching out to us if you need help finding things relating to a cemetery. We might have something that can help you. So the last thing I want to point out in this kind of group one of records is one of my favorites, which is newspapers. Newspapers are really fun and also a really important resource to look for, because I think a lot of people forget that newspapers can give you more than just an obituary. So the next few clippings I'm going to show you all relate to the same family, but they're all published. Most of them were published within a year of each other in late 1911, 1912. So what can you find in a newspaper? You can find marriage records like this one. This is a marriage announcement, actually, for John Haley and my great-great-grandmother, Claudia Robinson. You can also find birth announcements like this one on the left. So Mr. and Mrs. John Haley announced the birth of twins, a boy and a girl. And you can also find in the society pages of a newspaper little entries like this one, where it's detailing when someone has left town and who they are visiting. In this case, it just says Mrs. Haley has gone to Birmingham to an open air camp. So that's going to be relating to tuberculosis. This was roughly, this article on the right, was roughly 2 months after these twins were born. So we can assume she probably had tuberculosis. And if it was bad enough to where she's traveling from Tuscaloosa, Alabama to Birmingham, Alabama to an open air camp to receive treatment, we can kind of assume that she probably was pregnant and had tuberculosis at the same time. Knowing that information, the next two clippings are kind of put into more context. So here we see one of the twins, the boy, John, at 3 months old, he passed away. This was only about a month and a half after his mother went to that open air camp. Now, 3 months later, his mother, Claudia Robinson, she died, I suspect, of tuberculosis. These articles were a really important piece to the puzzle because the births for the twins and the deaths of this child and Claudia Robinson Haley, they were not reported. So there's no death records or birth records for any of them. So these articles kind of serve as the only birth and death records for these three people in the absence of some type of church record or a cemetery record. So next is group two. So these are the other types of records. After you've gotten your feet wet looking for different types of records, you'll probably have more questions. That's all part of the addictive nature of family history research. The next group of records I want to talk about are things that, like I said earlier in the program, you might find these in courthouses. Some of that stuff has been digitized. It all kind of depends on the county, depends on local laws. So things like land and deed records, wills and probate records, military, and also we'll talk a little bit about immigration. So that's some of the stuff we're gonna kind of get into. So land records. So at some point you're probably gonna wonder, do my ancestors own land? If so, where? How much did it cost? This is actually a record showing the sale of a lot in Fort Wayne from a man named Patrick E. Cox. The person who was buying it was a woman named Matilda Simon. And this is actually a property that I'm actually still currently researching. So I'm not sure if it was an empty lot when she purchased it or if her house had been built yet. But looking at this, not only we can see when this property came into the possession of this family, but we can also see how much she paid for it. I think it says in here $4,500 is how much she paid for the lot. So this is just one type of thing you can look for. Tells us when she got it, but also how much. So this is an example of a will. It's a section of a will actually for one of my Alabama ancestors. Records like this are really helpful to determine when someone died. If you're researching an ancestor who died in a time frame when death certificates were not common. So using records like this, you can also learn the names of children, grandchildren, or other family members who might be inheriting something from the estate. This document is like 4 pages long. It's surprisingly long for a woman, which is kind of interesting. But that can kind of give you a sense of your ancestors' financial situation by the end of their life. So again, these are things that kind of just add more to the story. So for military stuff, even if you know for sure that your ancestors, your father, grandfather, whoever, did not serve in the military, draft cards are still a really great record to look for to verify things like dates and occupations and tell you where someone's living at the time that they filed their draft. So this one is actually from World War I. It's for my great-grandfather, Samuel Nevin Hodges, which we saw his birth record earlier. So this actually is saying that he's a sailor and he worked for a company called United Fruit Company. So that's a World War I draft card. Now, this one is from World War II. This is from my grandfather. They're not going to, the format is going to change maybe a little bit between World War I and World War II, but there's still super helpful records to look for. Now, aside from draft and conscription records, if you think your ancestor did serve in the military, or if you discover that they do, there are dozens of other records you can look for that can offer some really rich information that, again, add a little bit more color to your family story. This is actually an index for my grandfather's World War II enlistment record. Not only does it show what branch of the military he was in, but this occupation section, it's actually showing the job he did during World War II. He was a photographer during the war, and that was his profession after the war. He did not do that previously. So you can look for enlistment records, things like muster rolls, pay rolls, because these guys are getting paid, regimental and company descriptive rolls, and you can also look for pension records. Pension records, they can be really fascinating when you start to dig into them. So the next thing we'll talk a little bit about are immigration records. The reason why I'm not going to dwell for a super long time on immigration records is just because we don't have a ton of time. But if your ancestor immigrates to the United States, what I do want to say is you want to try to find out as much information about them, about their life after they immigrated, before looking into all of these. I'm not saying that you can't, but you'll have an easier time figuring out who is maybe the right Samuel Hodges on a passenger list if you know a little bit more about him. And you can find that stuff out from looking at the American records. You got to start first here before you cross the pond is kind of what I'm getting at. So looking for things like passenger lists, border crossings, entry records. So that's going to be Castle Garden and Ellis Island. And then a whole other beast is the U.S. citizen and immigration records. The type of record you're going to want to look for citizenship is going to vary depending on the time period that the person filing is living in. So, and that has to do with changes to immigration laws and how U.S. immigration laws evolved over the years. So it's also important to remember that not everyone petitioned for naturalization. Not everyone could afford it. Not everyone realized that they had to. So that's something to keep in mind. So tools of the trade. You're now wondering, okay, she's told me about all these great records, but where do I find them? Online resources and physical resources. And we also have databases that are free that the Genealogy Center offers. I typically like to start with Family Search and Ancestry. You just kind of start with that simple search. All of these databases here, these are all things that the Genealogy Center, if you visit us, we pay for subscriptions to these. Family Search is free, but the rest of these are paid subscriptions. So if you visit, regardless of whether or not you're an Allen County resident, you can access these for free if you're here. But this list of free databases that we offer, these are all things you guys can access from home. You don't actually have to be here. In the handout, I did put a link to our website where it shows our resources so you guys can explore some of this. As far as physical stuff, I strongly encourage you to dig into social and local history because our family stories are not limited to names and dates and locations. Our ancestors' lives were impacted by the world they lived in. So doing some research into the time period will help you understand a little bit more about their lives and also their actions. Guidebooks are also very helpful, and compiled genealogy books, look at them with caution. Not everyone will source their information. No two genealogy like research books, like compiled family history books, are going to be the same. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, one thing I like to do to figure out whether a source exists, and if so, where can I find it? The first thing I do is look in the Family Search Research Wiki. It's like Wikipedia for genealogy. A fast, in my opinion, fast and kind of efficient way of finding a very specific type of page is you can, honest to God, just Google something like U.S. military pension records, and then add in after that genealogy or family search. And usually the page for that will be the first thing that comes up, and it'll have links to where you can find resources. It's really great stuff. Aside from this, the next thing to do to find things, but this is kind of an example of one of those pages where we have links to records and guided research and stuff like that. But aside from Family Search, the next thing you could look at are guidebooks like these two, the Source to a guidebook to American genealogy, and the Red Book. This will tell you if things exist, if they burned in a fire, stuff like that. I did put information about these also in the handout. So research, okay? This is what the key, right? You'll never actually do your family history stuff if you don't actually do the research. So you want to just start with a simple search. This is a screenshot from Ancestry. I just want to show as an example. So this is my grandfather. You don't have to be super specific when you put this information in, just kind of a general birth year. And I knew where he was born, but I just did Louisiana to make it simple. And it's helpful to search with another person, to search with a relationship. If you don't know mother's maiden name, just leave it blank. So when you do this, when you find a record that you know is true, that is the right thing, One thing you can do is look at suggested records over here in this right-hand column. These are not always going to be right, but they can kind of help get you going and finding more information. So as you're researching, just a couple tips and tricks for organizing your research. It is helpful to create some type of research journal or research log just to keep track of what you're looking at. And you can write in there if you're not finding anything. It's kind of cathartic, in my opinion, to kind of express all of that. Also, continuing to update those ancestry charts and family group sheets, they can kind of help you visualize the bigger picture. So that's a helpful thing to do. And try not to let the paper pile up. I know there are probably going to be people out there like, but I want to print everything. You can print things, that's fine. But it's good to try to have backups of everything. So you're going to want digital files of your research. So I like to back things up in multiple external hard drives. I use multiple cloud storage sites. I use both Dropbox and Google Drive. But when you have those digital files and the paper files too, consistency is key. Label things, organize things by surname, have subfolders. Just make it consistent throughout and just keep up with it as you're doing it. Because if you let it get out of hand, you will very quickly feel very overwhelmed. And we don't want that. We want to have a nice, enjoyable experience. So just try to keep up with stuff, not let it become piles of paper and then you don't know what to do with it. Also use universal file formats and stuff like that. Technology and Google are your friends, ultimately. So we did talk about analyzing stuff kind of as we're going along when we're looking at various examples. But this is a really important part of the research process because it's taking the time to analyze the records you're finding, because it's really frustrating to find a record that leads you to more and more records only to realize that you're looking at the wrong family. If that happens, it's okay. This type of thing happens all the time. It means that you might need to just reassess the information you have. A big mistake people make is trying to rely too heavily on Ancestry public trees or like the public tree on Family Search. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to show you how I kind of break apart those public trees on Ancestry. So this is for a relative of my husband's. For those who use Ancestry, when you get a hint like this and it looks like Ancestry public member trees, when you click review, you'll see probably a number of these. This would be my tree. This would be the other person's tree. You're going to want to look at the sources, how many records they have. If they have less than you, especially if it's significantly less than you, it's probably not going to be good stuff, but it might be. You can look at it. What you would want to do is click on that profile name. So this person, Nora Teresa Griffin, you'll see the page that's in that other person's tree. And you can go through all of these sources and see, are these right? What I like to do is if I click on one like this one, open this page, if I go through all this information, go through the original document and decide, yes, this is what I want, this is the right person, instead of saving the Ancestry public tree, I'll go up here, click save, and save to someone in my tree. That way the source is actually in my tree versus it just saying Ancestry public member trees. Just kind of a tip for you guys. Now, the final thing I kind of want to do is look at the 1930 census, which person is the right one. So I want to kind of give you kind of my thought process when I'm analyzing a document. So my great-grandfather, he turns up on the 1930 census twice. So in two different addresses. So when you look at this one at the top, the age matches up, the people living with him, so his mother, stepfather, siblings, they all match up. And in the bottom one, his age matches up, his wife, that's him, and these are his in-laws. So I'm like, these are the same people. How can this be? You can't live in two places at once. So the first thing I did was look to see when was it enumerated. So if this happens to you, which it happens on a rare occasion, you want to see when did the census taker go to the door, because they're going door to door. They were both enumerated on the same day, but Roy Joseph Gonzalez and Claudia Crum got married the day before. So in one of those households, you had one of the parents of each of them claiming them on the census, even though they were actually no longer living there. And that's something that happens. But this is all stuff you want to look at. Just kind of pick it apart based on what you know. And finally, the last bit of advice I want to offer you guys is that it is okay to get stuck. It's okay if you can't find everything there is to know about your family immediately. Just remember, take a breath, take a break if you need to, but never be afraid to ask for help. So at the Genealogy Center, we want to make your research as successful as possible. So if you can't find something, if you need help, if you have questions, send us an email. Sometimes all you need is just another set of eyes or a different perspective to help you you in those moments when you think you've found all that you can find. As I said at the beginning of the program, there are many reasons why people want to start doing genealogy research. Regardless of those reasons, the one thing that kind of binds us all together as a human race is the power of a story. Everyone has a story to share, and to me, the big part of doing family history research is the journey we take as researchers, as well as humans, to find those stories from within our families and within ourselves and have the courage to share them.